Vegetation cover. What is the attribute that we call cover? Well, it can be defined as the percentage of the ground that's covered by vegetation or other surface features. Now, when we're specifically referring to plant cover, we define that as the vertical projection of plant material onto the ground when viewed from above. Cover is always reported in units of percent. Now, cover is a very commonly measured attribute in rangeland systems, and that's because it's an important indicator of both ecological processes and ecological importance, as well as management effectiveness. For example, we can derive information about species dominance and importance, as well as the functioning of ecological processes from cover data. For example, in the image that we see here, we see a pinyon juniper woodland that is dominated by juniper trees and, to a lesser extent, pinyon trees. And so this provides, just by measuring the cover, we can say something about the relative abundance and dominance of these different trees. We also have information about ecological processes because the larger cover, the trees that have more cover, access more soil resources such as water and nutrients, as well as light. And so we get information about energy capture. Cover is related to biomass, but it's easier for us to measure. We can also see, if you look at the bottom of the image, that there's a grassland meadow below the slope. And we see that the species composition changes. There is far more cover of grasses in the lower part of the image. And so the dominance and the importance of different species changes. Cover also provides information that is relevant to management. So it can provide us information about the forage availability of a site, also soil conservation information. Sites that have more cover over the soil surface have less erosion hazard or risk of erosion in general. And so we often will measure canopy cover, basal cover, and ground cover to provide us some information about soil protection and soil conservation. Cover also gives us different types of information about wildlife habitat quality. And of course, this is specific to the wildlife that we're interested in, so the species of wildlife, and also the nature of the habitat that we're interested in, whether we are trying to quantify nesting cover, hiding cover, bedding cover, etc. So there are several advantages of cover. I mentioned that it is related to biomass and it's relatively easy to measure. It's fairly easy to learn and not nearly as difficult as measuring biomass. We can also use cover to describe various life forms, and so you can, using the same method, oftentimes we can measure cover of grasses, forbs, and shrubs at the same time. And another advantage of cover is that we don't need to identify individuals. You may recall that for density, defining the individual is often very important, what we consider to be the individual. In this case, with cover, we often measure cover to the species level, but it doesn't matter what individual the plant cover belongs to. We're just interested in knowing what species it is, and it doesn't matter if it came from one individual or from different individuals as we are measuring it. There are also some disadvantages of cover. First of all, it is sensitive to changes in precipitation. And by this I mean both seasonal changes as well as annual or interannual changes. So the size or the amount of cover that we have, especially canopy cover, will vary throughout a year as the amount of precipitation and also favorable temperatures for plant growth occur. In years when we have limited precipitation, because of moisture limitations on growth, cover can be quite reduced compared to other years. And so it will change. It's quite a changeable attribute. It's also sensitive to herbivory. Obviously, if you have grazing animals coming through an area, removing above ground biomass, the amount of cover that that biomass provides will be affected by the presence and the activities of those animals. Now, those comments are specific primarily to canopy cover, and so often we will measure basal cover or ground cover because these are more robust or stable under changes in precipitation and herbivory compared to canopy and foliar cover. So let's examine different types of cover. First of all, there are several that are specific to plants. So foliar cover, canopy cover, basal cover, and total vegetation cover are all specific to plant or vegetation cover. Ground cover and habitat cover are different types of cover, and they are unique in their own definition and applications. Let's examine first canopy cover. In this case, what we see here are two images of a hypothetical grass plant. Here we see a side view of a grass plant where it's emerging from the soil surface, and we're looking at the cover or the canopy cover of this plant from the side and from above, or the bird's eye view that's at the bottom. With canopy cover, what we see here is that the spread of the canopy defines the amount of cover. So this would be the total width of the canopy or the maximum radius in this case here. And when we're talking about canopy cover, we often are describing the amount of cover of the total canopy of the plant, and we don't pay a lot of attention to the gaps between the leaves unless they tend to be fairly large. So you can see that in this the lower part of the diagram, the orange halo kind of represents what we would imagine to be the canopy cover, and we don't distinguish between the gaps that are between the leaves. Now that's different than foliar cover. Here we see the same plant, but with foliar cover, we're interested in the amount of cover that is provided only by the leaves or the foliage of the plant. So again, you can see that the overall spread of the foliar cover, the width of the cover is about the same. But what we see by looking at the bird's eye view or the top-down view is that the orange halo is quite reduced, and we can actually see the gaps that are between the leaves. In this case, when we're measuring cover, we're focusing only on the cover that is provided by the leaf material. And the last kind of cover that we're going to examine here is basal cover. Again, we have the same plant, but here with basal cover, we're interested in the cover that is provided by the base of the plant. And so the width of the basal cover is defined by the diameter of the base of the plant. And we can see in the top-down view as well that this orange line here defines the base of the plant. With herbaceous species, we usually define that we measure basal cover at 1 inch or 2.5 centimeters above the soil surface. Now there are a number of different terms that are used sometimes interchangeably for plant cover. And so let's take a look at these right now. Crown cover is a term that really has its roots in forestry because we would talk about the crown of a tree, and it's often used interchangeably with canopy cover, the crown of a tree or the canopy of a tree. We often use those terms interchangeably. Aerial cover is another term that is used to define the cover provided by the aerial portion of a plant. And so sometimes this is used interchangeably with foliar cover or with canopy cover. For example, in the book by Elzinga et al., they will use the term aerial cover sometimes synonymously with canopy cover. And then DBH is a term that is used specifically for trees. In order to measure the basal cover of a tree, that provides a lot of good information, but it's difficult to measure at the base of the tree because there's often a lot of variation in where the soil is at the base of a tree. And so from forestry practices, DBH, which is defined, or it's the abbreviation for diameter breast height, is defined in the United States and in Canada as 1.4 meters above the ground. That would be the height at which we would measure the circumference of the tree trunk or the bole of the tree. DBH varies depending on what country you're in. In some parts of Europe, DBH is defined at 1.3 meters above the ground. But essentially, DBH and basal cover are synonymous, although we use basal cover for herbaceous species. Now, total vegetation cover is the cover of all species combined. And so when we measure either the canopy or the foliar cover or basal cover by species, we can combine this for different species in the same functional groups and describe it as functional group cover, or we can combine all species and describe total vegetation cover. I would like to mention that when we do measure cover, oftentimes we will measure both canopy and basal cover at the same time, but we don't mix them. So when you're describing total vegetation cover, it would either be total basal vegetation cover or total canopy cover. So in the image here, we see this fellow measuring cover of shrubs and forbs and grasses, and he could calculate that cover on a species by species basis, or it could be reported as the total vegetation cover of all species combined. Now, ground cover is a very different sort of cover, but it has very important applications to rangeland management. It's defined as the percentage of the soil surface that's covered by some type of protective material. And so it excludes anything that you would consider to be bare soil or bare ground, and it has very important implications for soil conservation. Let's look at some commonly measured ground cover categories. Rock is usually defined as a certain size, usually larger than 2 or 3 inches in diameter, depends on how that's defined. Gravel is usually smaller than rock, but it certainly provides protection of that soil surface. Litter, outlined here in blue, there's actually a lot of litter in this image. Litter is detached plant material that covers the soil surface. It's often used as a ground cover category, but not by all users. And litter will provide protection of that soil surface from, say, raindrop impact. It is more ephemeral, though, than, say, rocks or plant bases. Now, the plant bases, or what we may call as veg base cover, is nearly the same as basal cover. And so when we are measuring ground cover, which we usually do with points, it depends on the point, whether it falls on a rock or on litter, on plant bases. We also include bedrock, biological crusts. Depending on the system that you're in, you may want to include other definitions. And the important point here, as you see where these X's have appeared, is that these are at points where the soil is unprotected and we have bare ground or bare soil. Now, habitat cover is the last type of cover, and this is really actually a term that is reserved to describe cover specifically for wildlife. So it has an application, and it's not really synonymous with a specific attribute of vegetation cover because it has different use. So we could be considering nesting cover, hiding cover, bedding, or foraging cover. And in this case, cover is related to that specific use and not really a type of measurement that we take. We take measurements on the plants themselves and then may use that to provide information about habitat cover. But it's important that we make that distinction here. And finally, there are a number of different methods that can be used to measure cover. And these include methods that use lines and points, as well as area-based methods that use plots. Charting, remote sensing, and photographs can sometimes incorporate lines, points, or plots, but at different scales. And so in future lesson, we will be looking at measurement methods for cover.